legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Dominic Frisby, who joins us to discuss his book Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. The world around us appears to be falling apart. Political discord, protests and social unrest, riots and wars, climate chaos and economic collapse. Incompetent, corrupt or tyrannical governments often have a hand in this gathering global disorder, funded to a great extent by extracting money from their populations under threat of force. Death and taxes are our inevitable fate. We've been told this since the beginning of civilization. But what if we stop to question our antiquated system? Is it fair? And is it capable of serving the needs of our rapidly changing modern society? Daylight Robbery traces the origins of taxation from its roots in the ancient world through to today. It explores the role of tax in the formation of our global religions, the part tax played in wars and revolutions throughout the ages, and why, at one stage, we paid tax for daylight or for growing a beard. Ranging from the despotic to the absurd, the tax laws of the past reveal so much about how we got to where we are today and what we can do to build a system fit for the future. Hello and welcome, Dominic, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Dominic, today we're going to be discussing your latest book, just about to come out. It's entitled Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Before we dive into that, just give listeners a little bit of information about your background, your work in general.
Well, I have a very, I suppose you'd call it an unusual background, in that I started out my professional working life as a voiceover artist, and I've been the voice of many things over the years. And then I sort of in my mid to late 20s took up stand-up comedy, and I made a bit of money, and I was looking for a way to invest it. We're in the 2000s now, and I started hearing all these interesting people on the internet who I thought I'd really like to talk to them and get some financial advice from them. So I, rather like you, I started my own podcast as a means to talk to them. And one of the people I interviewed was a lady called Merrin Somerset Webb, who offered me a job writing at Money Week. This would have been about 2006, 2007. So I started doing that, Mr. Freelancer, doing everything. And, you know, before long, I suddenly realized I was both a stand-up comedian and a financial writer, which is a sort of unusual combination, but it sort of vaguely works. And I've now written, I write a weekly investment column for Money Week, and I've written for all sorts of other publications, and just published, as you say, my third book called Daylight Robbery, all about the past, the present, and the future of taxation. And the reason I've written about taxation is I used to think it was money, but now I think it's almost more important than money is tax. And if you think of a zombie film, there's a common trope in a zombie film is this idea of the zero patient. And this is the patient where the zombie virus started. And the hero of the story, in order to save the world, has to somehow get to the zero patient and either kill him or her, or the zero patient will have the antidote with which he can save the world. But one way or another, you have this idea of the zero patient. And I'm convinced that in a society, our system of tax is the zero patient, and everything starts from there. So if you can fix our system of tax, you change society for the good. And if you have a bad system of tax, then your society is destined to underachieve.
Now, in a nutshell there, you basically outlined why this issue does actually affect everyone, and in my recorded introduction, I've tried to do the same in my own way to make people understand this is not a dry financial podcast for professionals, but for many people, the average person who might stumble upon this, they might be thinking, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I pay a bit too much tax, I'd rather pay less. Who wouldn't? There may be some people thinking, well, no, I'd be happy to pay more tax, and we should definitely tax the rich, and that's one of the great, modern tropes of our, in our contemporary media. But just expand upon what you've just said as like, why is anyone starting to listen to this? Why should they stay tuned? Why does this in fact affect everyone so profoundly?
Well, unfortunately, the average person doesn't have it within his or her power to change our system of tax. But it is quite easy. It's not the most impossible thing for a politician to do. I think a lot of politicians express frustration that they're so powerless to actually change things. But our system of tax, they do, in theory, have control over it. And so it is within their power to reform it. But in the Enlightenment, for example, the morals of tax were heavily discussed. And now people just don't talk about tax in the way that they once did. And, the ancient Greeks actually thought that the freedom of society could be measured by its system of taxation. And there is a direct correlation between the two. So my first thing is just simply to get people talking about taxation again. Now, this isn't like talking about your last month's VAT return or something, because I think that's a pretty dull subject. But the impact of taxes on the course of civilization is one of the most interesting. Once you start looking at the world through this prism of taxation, so many things start to make sense. Why things happened as they did, why the world is as it is today, how the world's going to look in the future. Taxation in a funny kind of way is destiny. And, every great event in history, if I challenge you to name me a great event from history, and I almost without exception, there is some kind of tax story at its heart, and it's often an overlooked and untold tax story. But without that tax story, that event would not have happened in the way that it did. It would have turned out very differently. So, go on, I'll challenge you, Greg. Just name me any event from history. Just the first thing that comes into your head.
Death of Jesus.
The death of Jesus. Okay. Well, at Jesus' birth and at his death, there is a tax story. Mary and Joseph, the only reason they were in Bethlehem when Jesus was born was they were there to pay taxes. Augustus had sent out his census. So if without tax requirement, they would never have been in Bethlehem. Jesus would not have been born in the way that he did, and Christianity could never have evolved in the way that he did. So there's a tax story at his birth. At his death, the charge for which he was eventually crucified was, this whole thing of being a false king. The Romans were pretty tolerant of other religions. There were some, like Judaism, they pretty ruthlessly put down, but others they were pretty tolerant about. But people claiming to be a king was a serious crime as far as they were concerned, because another king had the power to levy taxes, and that was a threat to Roman tax revenue and Roman control. So the crime, if you like, for which Jesus was eventually crucified, Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. Only non-Romans could be crucified, and they could only be crucified for one of three crimes. One was attempting to escape from slavery, and by the way, slavery itself is a form of taxation in that you are 100% owned. Your labor is 100% owned. Highway robbery was another crime that you could be crucified for, and the other was piracy and sedition. And the famous line, the mob, when they brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate, they cried, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute, i.e. tax, to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king." And sedition was the charge for which he was eventually crucified. And Jesus encouraged that sedition by encouraging non-payment of taxes. So, Jesus' birth and his death, there's a tax story. And I just think that's incredibly interesting. You can go all the way back to the beginning of human civilization, and there were taxes in ancient Mesopotamia, the tithe. It was called Ezretu. And you go all the way through history, and that tithe evolved, and the idea of the tithe was common to pretty much every ancient culture. And you go back through history, and there has never been a civilization without taxation of some kind. Now, the libertarian will tell you that taxation is theft, and it is theft because you're having things taken from you against your will a lot of the time. But the social democrat or the socialist will tell you that tax is the price we pay for a civilized society. And there is some truth to that as well. Both of those statements have some truth to them. And this is the eternal moral dilemma. Is tax theft, or is tax the price we pay for a civilized society? Now, I'm sure, at the moment in the UK, we're 45-50% of what we earn over the course of our life is taken from us in taxes. That's half of your labour is owned, and half of the serf's labour was owned. And in terms of your working week, you spend half of your working week working for yourself and half of your working week working for the government. Well, the serf was the same. He spent half of his working week working for his lord, and the other half of his labour, he could till his little strip of land and keep the produce of that land for himself. So in terms of time spent, our existence is not that different from the life of the serf. Obviously, I think our existence today is considerably better. So tax is this, it occupies this enormous space in our life, and tax is power. If a king or a god a king or a emperor or a government, if they lose their tax revenue, they lose their control, and taxes are by the means by which they exert control. So it's just this incredibly interesting subject, in my opinion. To finish off, I think the idea of taxation predated civilization. A lot of anthropologists agree that this idea of the duty, the sense of duty to the greater collective, existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. And remember, taxation isn't just money, it's a share of your labor, or a share of your produce, or a share of your profit. These are all different ways by which you have taxes levied against you.
Well, the root of my feeling about this subject go right back to my early life, as early as I can remember, really. And when I first discovered that I was going to have to go to school, at age 3 or whatever, I went to some sort of preschool thing, and I put up tremendous resistance to this because I just wanted to stay at home with my Lego and books and whatnot. Why do I have to go and join this collective thing that, my parents didn't even seem to know very much about? And that later crystallized into this idea, which you could apply to school or tax or all these other sorts of things that we apparently get born into. And that is, quote unquote, where did I sign up for this? I didn't agree to this. But, you're born into a society, wherever it happens to be, communist, fascist, socialist, democratic, whatever it happens to be, all these different flavors of societies and civilizations. And some people go on to change the societies that they're in, and sometimes in profound ways. Other people just go along to get along, and they think that's just the way things are. But I wanted to know, where did I sign up for this? And that, for me, encapsulates the sort of tension around all of this. Which, as you say, the quote in your book actually is the duty to the greater collective, which is, I think, is a natural human impulse. I think we're cooperative beings, cooperative creatures. Yeah. And we get a lot of great things done by cooperating. But it's like, where do you draw the line? So the question has always been, I'm all for a voluntary society, where anything that you take part in, you agree to. Some of it you might, through gritted teeth and say, okay, we do have to have a rubbish collection, so, I'll chip in, that's fine. But the problem is that you get people who want different things. Some people, they want different amounts of money allocated to different things. So that is the tension. How do we organize that so that lots of different people, perfectly good, well-meaning human beings, that they can be catered for to work with people who they agree with to some extent, and not have what we see, which is society's riven by, no, we should do this, and we should do this, and we shouldn't do that, often orientated around money.
Well, what I was actually going to say in my big, long opening rant, but I forgot to get to the point, was that I think if you said to most libertarians, we're at 50% at the moment. If you said to most libertarians, I'll offer you 20, we'd take it just straight away. We go, all right, you can have 20% of my labour. If you leave, as long as you leave the other 80% to me, that's fine. So, so it is a sort of, it is an imposition, but, and in fact, an impost, same word, is, you impose a tax, and taxes were called an impost. It's amazing the number of different words there are for tax, by the way, and we can talk about that in a second. But you're absolutely right. Now, ancient Greece, in ancient Greece, most taxes were voluntary. Now, that is a lovely idea. This is what pisses a lot of people off, and me included, is, I never signed up for this. I was born in Britain, and, I don't think the NHS is the best way to provide the best possible health care for the most possible people at the lowest possible price. But if I say that, I'm told I'm immoral for thinking that thought. I get the modern equivalent of being excommunicated. So I didn't sign up for the NHS, so I didn't sign up for state education, and I educated my kids privately, and so I effectively paid for education twice. And some guy said, well, you earn more money than the average person, so you that's your problem. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I still had to pay for it twice, and that's incredibly wasteful. And I could have spent that or invested that money much better. So I mean, it is the fundamental, it's the never-ending argument, and it will blight not just democracies, but it will blight, every society. But, look to the ancient Greeks, one of the most enlightened societies in history, and taxes were voluntary. They had this thing called liturgy, and this idea of sacrifice was embedded in the Greek psyche, and all the early Greek myths, there's always this thing of sacrifice, Prometheus and Athena and various others, and duty to the collective. But it was the rich in society were expected to shoulder the burden of the city's needs because of the disproportionate amount of the wealth of the city that they owned. But if a street needed building, or a bridge needed building, or they needed a new building, or that they needed a new warship, or it was deemed that there should be some games or a theatre festival or whatever it is, the rich were expected to take this thing on in a system called liturgy. And not only were they expected to fund this undertaking, they were expected to carry it out themselves. So they would have had control over it. So they wouldn't be giving their money to a bureaucrat to spend on their behalf. They would be managing the purse strings themselves. And, presumably in many cases, they'd got rich because they were competent. One expects that, when they're risking their own capital on this venture, they will carry it out better than somebody else would spending their money. And at the end of the day, their reputation was on the line. If they put on a really good games, or they built a really good bridge, or they built a really good warship, or whatever it was, that ship would have their name on it. That bridge would have their name on it. And so it was in their interest to do it as well as possible. And Pericles, the famous old Greek king, he really exploited the liturgical system for his advantage. It helped him take control of Athens. And, I'm sure it got corrupted. It eventually died out with the Peloponnesian War. But, the taxes became obligatory, as they always do. It's always war that's the problem. But, it was a beautiful system. And there's, it's really hard to get from where we are to there. But if I were starting from scratch, I would look to be able to do something like that.
Well, yeah, some of what you say was echoed a little bit later on in times that maybe listeners can identify with a little more. I'm thinking now of some of the friendly societies in Victorian Britain.
Sure.
Some of the great
friendly societies were wonderful.
And some of the great industrialists as well. I'm thinking of, the Carnegie and people like that. Now, we're not saying anything about conditions for workers per se here. We're just talking about that voluntary, independent contributions to society.
Yeah. But, conditions for workers were worse. Of course they were, because we were 150 years more backward. But Victorians were one of the most charitable, gracious societies that we ever experienced. Now, there are all sorts of horrors in, Victorian slums and so on, but it was also in terms of improvements in standard of living, it was one of the greatest periods of progress ever. And, particularly in Britain and America, which had very low levels of tax. In 1900, tax was 10% of GDP compared to 50% now. And it was an extraordinary period. And some of the greatest Britons that ever lived were lived in that period. And it was that low tax, high levels of freedom, individual responsibility, which leads to innovation and experimentation and invention and all these kind of things, and trade and commerce and exchange. And that's how we progress. And it's just a wonderful time in terms of human progress. I mean, we can't build a house today as well as they built that back then.
No, absolutely we cannot. I mean, we have to look at the housing stock. I think in lots of parts of the world, but in Britain particularly, what is there most of remaining from the distinct, architectural time periods? And it's Victorian. And if you give, also that a lot of it was, in my view, needlessly demolished, at various times, not just talking about by the Nazis, but, by the British government.
I mean, what were they thinking? Just build, if you don't like it, go and build something else somewhere else. Leave that. That's nice.
Now, you mentioned the NHS a few moments ago, and that's a very emotive subject for all sorts of reasons. For listeners outside of the UK, that's simply the National Health Service in the UK, which is free at the point of use, as they call it. But of course, nothing's really free. It's just a question of who pays for it. That emotive language around these national institutions, like public transport's another one, is very much playing.
I was on Radio 4 the other day, and I said I don't agree with state education. And the woman called me repugnant.
Yeah, which is just bizarre, because that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any state education, but it's just like, well, you may not want to choose that. But around the issue of taxation at the minute, and almost everyone listening to this, I'm sure, will be familiar with the issues around corporate tax avoidance, which gets conflated with tax evasion. There's a lot of talk about tax shaming now, and the super rich and offshoring money. Meanwhile, things like the National Health Service and all these other public services are apparently in crisis. And if we could only get some of Amazon's money or Starbucks money or Google's money or Facebook's money, then that could be channeled into that and it would all be fixed. So whatever the actual facts in these cases, or whatever the situation actually is, it's clouded in a fog of emotive language and name calling, and so it's very difficult to have an actual objective discussion about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's just terrible, and it's how manipulative people are, and it's why the election after election is a surprise, because I'm sorry to say this, but the left are more guilty than the right in this regard. If you start saying stuff with which they don't agree, like I went on the BBC Radio 4 yesterday, and there's some left-wing economist. I'm not even going to say her name. I'm not even going to give her the grace of giving her the bad publicity. But she goes on this rant on Twitter, and she's obviously got the hump because she's written a book and she hasn't got on BBC Radio 4 Start the Week. She goes on this rant on Twitter and tries to get me no platformed. Why is the BBC giving a platform to this right-wing bigot? And all this kind of stuff. And there's just a total intolerance of any other view apart from your own. And, how can you attempt to have a sensible conversation and move the conversation forward and discuss if you will not tolerate any other views apart from your own being uttered? And so what happens is, people are sick of being called, in my case, repugnant. But, they're just, you said something that you think, immigration could be a bit of a problem in this country. You're racist. There's all these smears, and people don't want to be smeared, so they just keep their mouths shut. And then the election comes along and they vote for Brexit, or they vote for Boris, or whatever it is. And then the left get their knickers in a twist because the far right have taken over. So there's all these smears go on. And I'm really sorry, but if you just use those kind of tactics, it's a form of censorship. And by the way, the censor is a Latin word, and the censor was a Roman magistrate who was one of his responsibilities was supervising public morality But his other job was doing the census. He was responsible for collecting taxes. So there is this relationship, even linguistically, between taxation and freedom, censorship. So there's this I think it's really interesting that the word, censorship involves the restriction of freedom, and so does taxation. And I find it really interesting that they both originate from the same word.
Well, it's one of the reasons why we don't always get the best people in public life in this and most other countries as well, is because it's not encouraged. I don't think Boris Johnson's the best person out of any possible candidates to be Prime Minister of this country, but there he is. I just think...
Who, just out of interest, are you going to vote in the election?
I've never voted.
Okay.
But I'm playing my part in the unfoldment of the universe, and it does not involve voting for politicians. That's just my take on it. I've been called, not exactly immoral, but words to that effect for not voting. But what is the right if it's then compulsory? Is that the only way to change things? Vote for politicians? But
oh my God. I've spent the last 3 elections drawing a massive cock on my ballot paper, without wishing to be too crude.
Fine.
I just think by voting you're endorsing a system that's broken. And this general election, I was at first quite excited about it. I mean, I don't know if you're a Leaver or a Remainer, but I'm a Leaver. And I thought this general election was quite important because it was going to fix everything. But I'm really quite disappointed in that, the Tories have quite clearly revealed. I know the Tory party's got, it's been taken over and there's new people running it and so on and so forth. But, they're pledging all this spending. Somebody's got to pay for that. And, this is the problem is politicians make these promises, in order to win votes, the obligations. And, the Tories are going to walk this election anyway. They didn't need to make all these promises. The obligations then have to be met. And that means, that it's not the politician who pays, it's the people. And, through higher taxes. And it kind of gets my goat. And anyway, but the Conservative had 3 years to deliver Brexit. One of the beauties of Brexit, as far as I'm concerned, it has just pulled the curtain back on the British establishment and revealed how totally bent it is and what total contempt it has for the people. And what a sham this idea that Britain is democratic. And the one, saving grace from it all was Nigel Farage, who came along with the Brexit party and was a huge champion. And you thought, finally, we're going to get rid of this bent 2-party system and we're going to get some change. And there was a real sense of optimism. And, I just think it's really sad that the Brexit party's faded away. And, I think he decided there was a genuine chance that we go to second referendum. The Tories wouldn't get a majority without him. And so if that's the real reason he stood down, I don't know, but they've just completely disappeared. The Tories have been rewarded for failure. And I just think, they're going to control British politics for another 10 or 12 years. And I just think the wrong people are controlling it. And the essential, breaking away from this 2-party system that I hope Brexit would deliver is not going to happen. Well, it's going to be like one party and 5 shit ones.
Well, we'll see what happens soon enough, won't we? As I began to learn about tax as I was growing up, because I studied economics at school, that was a waste of time, but it did get me thinking about a few things. 2 things became foremost in my mind that I objected to. One was, I think we're talking about the UK now, but this applies in a lot of countries around the world, is that there's lots of different taxes for different things, but the general income tax, which is most tax that people pay, there's a big pot that's used for all sorts of different things, and we have very little control over what's done with our money. And that was one of my main objections. They take all this money and they can spend it on whatever. They'll maybe tell you what they're spending it on. You can get a breakdown of budgets and expenditure. But for people, for example, who don't want it spent on war, have no control over that. And whatever it is you don't like or you do like about what the government's doing with the money, it's very difficult to directly control that because it's just all rolled into general taxation and all sorts of objectionable things are included in that. And the other is that taxes ultimately will be taken by force, and if you take refusal to pay to the hilt, you will die. They will kill you. And I've said this to people and said, oh, don't be stupid, you just get fined and maybe go to prison. I'm talking about, think about it. You get your tax bill. You say, I'm not paying this. I object to it for the following reasons. Okay.
Well, you don't even get the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
It's taken its source.
Exactly. But let's just say you get into a dispute. And let's say you're self-employed and you get into a dispute with HMRC. And they say, okay, you owe us this amount. Okay, you haven't paid on time. Here's a fine. Plus you have to pay the amount anyway. Here's another fine. You're still not paying. You're writing them letters, emails. I object for this reason. Eventually, you'll end up in court, and it's like, okay, well, no more fines. You're going to get suspended prison sentence. No, then you're going to get an actual prison sentence. And they come round and say, you're okay, you're due in court, you didn't show up. You've been sentenced to 6 months in prison starting now. You stay in your house, locked in your house. It's your property. I'm not paying the tax. They'll come and get you to take you to prison. And if you resist too much, they'll apply force. And if you keep resisting, it could result in your death. It's as simple as that. And it wouldn't take that long for that to happen.
No, and in fact, HMRC doesn't operate by the same rules as the rest of, the whole thing about innocent until proven guilty and all of that. It's the other way round with HMRC. It's guilty until proven innocent.
Exactly. But the point, I think, and this is something a lot of people don't think about, is that, that pot of tax and you not having any choice or even knowledge about what it's being spent on. A lot of people just sort of say, oh, well, we know what it's going on. It's the NHS, whatever it happens to be. Yes, a bit goes to the army, but I think if people actually saw what was happening with the money and how that fails to meet government expenditure, how much they have to borrow to spend, I think that anybody who was able to sit down and really get their head around it will be appalled.
Yeah, and borrowing is taxation without representation. It's a tax on the future, and it's also taxation without representation because you're taxing people who haven't voted.
Exactly. And we have a very curious situation now. It's one thing for tax to be whatever it happens to be in booming times, when most people feel that they're on the up, even if they're starting at the bottom, if things are moving, the only way is up. But the situation we have at the minute is one, again, not just in the UK, but in many industrialized nations with declining living standards, purchasing power being eroded at the same time, working conditions becoming more onerous, steady work harder to get, house prices rising. So many people are feeling quite embattled at the minute. And of course, this aggravates the situation where it's saying, oh, the finger gets pointed at the super rich and corporate tax avoidance and yada, yada, yada. So it's everybody against everyone, really. And that's it. And again, that means we're not discussing, we're not thinking about it clearly. We can't actually see what the situation is. And I think, if anything, this is one of the things that your book's very good on, not just a historical context for all this, but just a bit of clarity. And I think in subjects that are not well understood, and because I don't think we're encouraged to understand tax and the inner workings of government. I think quite the opposite, actually.
No, we're not encouraged. And, that's another thing about this book is just to make people more aware of it and think about it and question it. And, talk about it. And, it's quite evil what goes on in a lot of cases. And there's just so many interesting stories. I just discovered a story this afternoon that I didn't even know. And I wish I'd known about it when I wrote my book. But there was a big group of people in, the late 18th century in Britain who were opposed to the Napoleonic War. And William Pitt, who was Prime Minister at the beginning, he was famous for taxing everything. Just like really stupid shit, like, signet rings. There was a tax on signets. William Pitt was notoriously inefficient with the public finances. And he raised taxes. And I think there was a famous quote of the day wherever there is an object, he will tax it. And he had taxed carriages, he taxed houses, windows, glass, horses, dogs, watches, coats of arms, all these different things. And one of the things he taxed in order to raise money for his war was wigs, and in particular wig powder. And because of his taxes on wig powder made wigs so expensive, people started using flour instead. And then this pushed up the price of flour, and there was real food shortages and food riots because the cost of flour was so high. That was and a lot of it had to do with William Pitt's wig taxes. Anyway, there was this group of people who were opposed to the war, and I just forget their names, but they stopped wearing wigs and deliberately cut their hair short to make a statement. So it was a bit like, the white feather or something in World War One. You had to have a license in some cases to wear the wig, and the license cost a guinea. And if you paid the guinea, you could wear your wig in this particular pigtail. And that's where we get the expression guinea pigs from. The eventual result of these guys wearing their hair short in order to make a statement, we are not paying this tax, we do not support this war, and that's where the fashion for short hair eventually came. So the wig tax actually changed the way people wore their hair and brought in an era of short hair through the 18th century. And even right up to 1869, they still had this stupid wig tax, even though nobody wore wigs anymore. That's just how slow government is to get rid of a tax.
Towards the end of your book, and it's by no means just a historical romp, which it certainly is, you begin to talk about a lot of issues that are changing the tax landscape now, and this is happening globally. And there's a lot of developments that are going to be, initially at least anyway, outside of the control of nation states, governments, and there's a lot of potential. There's some risks and downsides here in all of this, but there's a lot of positives that may benefit the stealthy and the fleet of foot and those who are ahead of the game in the years to come. And I'm thinking here of the mobility of individuals, to be able to live and work in different territories, in multiple territories, to move around. Technology is facilitating a lot of that, and the impact of automation and AI is changing all sorts of industries, and that's going to have knock-on effects for government as well. Cryptocurrency, which you've written a book about as well. The scalability of tech. So basically, government's tax bases are changing radically. It's not to their benefit as well. So talk about some of these developments, whatever your favourite points are. And the bottom line is that governments are going to have to do less, and that doesn't mean none of the things that people like from their governments or claim to like, but it just means that there are lots of things, lots of fingers in pies that they're going to have to get on involved with, basically.
Yeah, well, we often struggle to understand how government has got so big. And government has got so big because of the 2 world wars. It's very hard for governments to introduce new taxes in peacetime. You normally need some kind of emergency to get it through. And what happens is the emergency justifies the higher tax rates, and then after the war is over, after the emergency is passed, the tax rates never go back to where they were before the emergency started. They go to they come back a little bit, but they settle at a much higher level. And war gave rise to income tax. Prior to 1914 in the UK, income tax didn't touch ordinary people. It was only paid by the very rich, and the same in America. First World War brought taxes to every man in England, and then in the US, 1942 Revenue Act, World War II, brought income taxes to every man. Imagine that. Income tax is a very relatively new thing, and income tax has proved incredibly effective form of taxation because it is the responsibility of the employer to deduct the tax and pay it to the government before it even reaches the person who's done the work. This is, PAYE in the UK, which came in shortly after World War II. And so income tax is what makes this large social democrat society in which we live possible. Now, the relationship, 50% of government revenue in the developed world comes from income tax. 50%. Now, the relationship between employer and employee is changing. More and more people are not working for one employer for an extended period of time, often their whole life. More and more people have multiple income streams, more and more freelancers, the gig economy, contingent workers, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm Mr. Freelancer. I've got about 83 different income streams. Now, these kind of taxes, taxing the gig economy, has much harder to tax than the traditional relationship between income and between employer and employee. And by 2030, Ernst & Young have estimated that half the global workforce will be freelance, will be contingent, half. And that's just the nature of employment is changing. We have more and more freelancers. Now, in addition to that, our tax system was built around a physical age, a physical labourer who is working in this place, a physical good that is being transported from this place to this place across a clear border. And the problem is the physical economy is still growing, but at nothing like the rate that the intangible economy has grown, the digital economy, the internet. And this is where the real economic growth is. That's what's attracting the most investment. That's what's attracting the most workers. More and more of us are working in this intangible economy. The market cap of the three largest companies in Silicon Valley is over 60 times higher than it was 30 years ago. Now, the real world economy has seen nothing like that growth. You just look, companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook didn't even exist 20 years ago. I think Amazon is the youngest of those companies, and it was founded in 1994. And governments have found it extremely difficult to tax the intangible economy. Whether it's Starbucks going, well, there's our shops there, but our shops don't pay any money because they've got to pay all these enormous intellectual property rights. They've got to pay these enormous sums to use Starbucks brand. And so it's, Starbucks brand name company, which is offshore somewhere, I think in Holland or somewhere, some low-tax jurisdiction that makes all the money. Google, Amazon has relocated itself to Ireland. Ireland doesn't even have an Apple shop. And yet a Mac store. There's no Mac store in Ireland. That's what Apple really thinks of Ireland. And yet they've put their whole business there. And it's for tax reasons. And just governments have found it really difficult to tax the intangible economy. And the reason is that the internet is essentially a borderless medium. And I know there's like .co.uk and .com and .fr and .de and all the rest of it, but really it's a borderless medium. And more workers are going to work in this borderless medium. And they're doing freelance work in this borderless medium. There are more and more digital nomads, and people go, digital nomads. It's the fastest growing workforce. More and people, they start working from home, then they go to the coffee shop, and then they start traveling. And it's not just digital nomads from the West going, round Asia and so on. It's people from Africa and South America and Asia coming here. And it's a huge, huge workforce. And they all do things, their jobs, in the digital economy, and that doesn't require them to be at these premises at this time. Most of the huge amounts of their work they can do remotely. They might be web designers or computer programmers or whatever. Now, graphic designers, whatever it is. And 50% of them already work in the crypto economy. Now, the beauty of the crypto economy is, for this borderless medium, we need borderless money. We need a borderless money system, and Bitcoin and all its offshoots have provided that borderless money system. Well, it's much, much harder to control an economy when you don't control the money system. The governments don't control banks. If you're not paying your taxes, the government can freeze your bank account. Good luck trying to freeze your Bitcoin wallet. So all these new economies, government, unless they change the way they tax, they are going to struggle to tax the intangible economy. And that means they are not going to be able to carry on operating and offering the same number of goods and services they currently earn, because there will not be the revenue to pay for it. Now, there's going to be an almighty fight, and you'll see this clamping down, because government doesn't relinquish. It's not the nature of government to just give back. It always grows and it clings ever tighter. So there's a big confrontation coming. I still think we're many years away from that. And a lot of people, there's this whole politics of envy that we have in the UK of why should this person get away with paying taxes and without paying taxes, and I have to pay taxes. And I have a lot of sympathy from that. And this idea that, the rich have to pay all the taxes. But it's not that easy, because it's quite easy to just base yourself in low tax jurisdictions. And you're doing stuff that's quite legal. So there's this big almighty battle, and we're almost going to see two tiers of worker and two tiers of economy. The heavily taxed guy who's local, and then the more nimble guy who's not local, who operates in the intangible economy. And it means that many nation states won't survive this in their current form, and certainly many governments won't. and it's going to be very interesting seeing what plays out. But that is one of the big dynamics that you will see in the years ahead. And it's particularly, when government currencies start to collapse under all this debt, which sooner or later they will.
Yeah, and as we've alluded to a couple of times already, this is why you mentioned the politics of envy. We have so much demonization of some of these developments, like cryptocurrencies and various borderless ways of working, because you get a lot of national governments that will talk favorably about globalization, but what they really mean is, well, it's whatever it happens to be. It's something that they think will benefit them. But when it comes to individuals and independent groups taking advantage of some of the developments we've talked about, then that's to be, if it's outside of their control, then that's to be, as I say, demonized and condemned. And we will see, as we are already, attempts at coercive control along these lines to try and put the genie back in the bottle, which of course you can't do.
No, you can't. I don't quite know where it ends, but I think there's a big standoff coming. And I mean, one of the things that you're seeing this big thing of tax shaming. You mentioned it earlier in the program, and that's going to be a big thing, is that those who break out of the system will be attacked by those in the system who think the system is right. And, they say, we pay our taxes, you should pay your taxes. But there's no allowance for people like you who, you never signed up for it.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean that if you think that your government is inefficient or wasteful or corrupt, or that you don't like having this big chunk of your earnings taken without your consent and unaccountably spent, because
I can spend that money so much better.
But because you feel that doesn't mean that you want to see old people dying for want of medical attention. You don't want to see people lying in the streets because they haven't got a roof over their heads. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that there are ways to deal with society's needs and to look after those who need care and attention. There are ways to do that. So it doesn't, but again, these two things get put together. They get conflated, don't they? If you want to avoid paying tax to the government, then that means that you want old people to die on gurneys in hospital corridors or something.
Yeah, I mean, who wants people to suffer? I mean, who actually wants that apart from the odd sadist? That's not just wanting less government and wanting, there's this idea that the people will not be human, welfare, healthcare, education. These are essential human needs. They're not going to disappear if government doesn't provide them. So it really pisses me off that because I've just had it on this Radio 4 thing where people somehow think you've got some kind of abhorrent, you know who the immoral ones are? The immoral ones are the people who defend the NHS. Have you seen the latest one where is it? Not Mid-Staffs. There's another place, where all the kids, died after childbirth unnecessarily just due to hospital errors. No, and they, why are you supporting a healthcare system that repeatedly does this? You're the immoral one.
In terms of the future, then, we can expect some of the confrontations to be more than ideological. There's all sorts of reasons why we're seeing increased protests and unrest in various parts of the world, political...
Taxes behind almost all of them.
Yeah, political upheaval. Now, you talk about... We don't have time to get into this history as such, but you talk a lot about the history of Hong Kong in your book in terms of how things could be done differently. So, what do you make of what's going on there at the minute?
I haven't really followed it. Do you know what? I can't comment on it. I can tell you that under the British, Hong Kong had the most fantastically designed tax system. Tax never exceeded 14% of GDP. Income taxes were only paid by the very rich. I think about 40% of their taxation came through land value taxes, not income taxes. And economically, Hong Kong was one of the glorious success stories of the second half of the 20th century. And in fact, it was so successful that Singapore copied it, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan to an extent, and China itself copied it. Shenzhen is a direct copy of Hong Kong. And they all saw how successful Hong Kong was, and they thought, what's it doing? And they were clever enough to ape it. Now, the big irony of all of this was Hong Kong wasn't a democracy. it was an authoritarian British colony. There were no elections. But the funny thing was the British let Hong Kong get on with it. Britain was busy pursuing its own Keynesian ideology. The Hong Kong governors were all Adam Smith's nuts, and they all pursued this, laissez-faire Adam Smithism. And as a result, Hong Kong's population grew by 10 times, and its standard of living went from a fifth the size of England's in 1950. Per capita GDP was about a fifth of England's. Per capita GDP in Holland at this point was, on a par with most of Africa, to, in the space of 40 or 50 years, to having a per capita GDP that was 1.5 times the size of Britain. I mean, it's extraordinary.
A further point touching on the point I made about unrest and upheaval, if you actually use the phrase young authoritarians in your book or not, but certainly I've got it in my notes and that came from somewhere. And we do see...
I don't use it, but I rather like it.
Well, quite often along the fault lines of climate change and environmental challenges, and these always, of course, have an economic dimension as well, and as you say, everything ties into tax, we do see the beginnings of part of a generation that will be very willing to be very draconian, I think, if they get into positions of power, when it comes to certain measures, shall I put it like that, that would directly impact on some of the changes that we've just been talking about, in terms of working patterns and technology facilitating certain things. Government tax base starts to crumble. There are certainly people coming through who you'd have to say, where would they actually stop? Especially if anything is done under the umbrella of combating climate change, for example. It's almost like, well, we can go anywhere because that has to be dealt with. Who wouldn't? Who amongst us is going to say, oh no, I'm not giving my money for that?
Well, there are some serious nutcases out there, and they've just had their heads, they've been indoctrinated with shit. And they're like the new Nazis, some of them, the tactics they use, the mentality they have, the way they just think everyone who doesn't agree with us is evil in some kind of way. Some of these momentum guys, it's horrible what they're doing. And they think they're doing it for the good of justice, and the tactics they resort to. And so at some stage they've got to be blue pilled or red pilled, whichever, they've taken the wrong pill and they need to have the other one. But if they don't see the light soon, we've got some big problems ahead.
So just to end on a positive note, apart from reading your book, what would you say to some of the trying to be generous and trying to be constructive? What general message might you put to some of the people who might be your most vehement opponents currently? If you were trying to have a general, reach out of the hand and say, come on guys, look, if we can talk about this and do more of this, we'll all come out of this a bit better. It doesn't have to be the war of everyone against everyone that I mentioned earlier.
I say stop trying to control everyone. Live and let live.
Yes, well, I think that's probably a good point to end on, really. If we all did more of that, I think we'd be in a better place, wouldn't we? Today, Dominic, we've been discussing your latest book that's entitled Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. That's widely available.
I regard myself as a pretty good writer, but this is by far and away the best book I've ever written. And, if you're it's just, and I'm not going on full ranty libertarian stuff in it. I've tried to write it for people who are just interested. But once you start to look at the world through the prism of taxation, tax is control. And when you look at the world through this prism, so much starts to become clear. And, if any of your readers want to buy the book, you can buy a signed copy of me on my website or just Amazon, or the audio book read by me is I'm very proud of that as well. Lifetime of voiceover experience has gone into that. But, it's the best book I've ever written. I'm very proud of it.
Well, do share then, just before we sign off, your actual website details and obviously Twitter, anything else you might want to put out there?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I don't think I'm very good at Twitter, to be honest, but I'm on it, and I basically use it to plug myself. And my website is dominicfrisby.com, and if you're after a copy of the book, it's just go to dominicfrisby.com/blog, and you'll find it there. But I'm pretty present on the internet. It's not hard to find me. I've got a YouTube channel with some very amusing videos as well.
Well, once again, Dominic, thank you so much for joining us once again on legalisefreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.